Welcome to Talkback. Today we will be discussing the WTO and Indian agriculture once again. I have with me here Mr. Sharad Joshi. Welcome, Mr. Joshi. As the pioneer agitator for the cause of the Indian farmer, Mr. Joshi started the Shetkari Sangathan more than 20 years ago. Mr. Joshi heads the National Task Force on Agriculture, which has been set up by the Government of India today. That's quite a long movement from an agitator to actually participating in shaping the policy of the Government of India. So Mr. Joshi, as the government joins in the WTO negotiations that are going on in Geneva, we see growing unrest on the part of farmers back at home. If I were to start with history at first, can I ask you what your view is? Do you think that we got a raw deal for Indian farmer at the WTO negotiations last time round?
If one could get into the mindset of the people who are actually negotiating in the Uruguay round, it's difficult to imagine what their agenda was. Most of them started with the idea that we possibly would have no negotiations at all. And when the negotiations actually started, the objectives were not very clearly defined, with the result that in a way we were sort of dragged on. And finally we found ourselves in a situation where we had to generally accept the consensus that was evolving at the end of the 8th round. But beyond that, it's very difficult to say what was the mindset, what did they succeed in achieving. We were not as well prepared that time as we would have liked to be. But then we are not particularly well prepared this time either.
Really? You know, at that time, some of us believed that India was really happy to be left alone with the controls on imports as far as Indian agriculture was concerned. So we didn't really pay attention to what we were allowing the European economies or other developed economies to get away with, high tariffs, high subsidies. Would that be a fair description of what happened?
That's only one aspect of the WTO agreement on trade. There are other aspects. But when we are talking about WTO, what is contained in the agreement and what is likely to happen hereafter, one must remember that we are not starting on a clean slate. India is in a class by itself as regards the agricultural situation. Number one, we had a sort of a socialist planned economy which believes in conservation of foreign exchange. So we had a whole plethora of license permits for imports as also exports. Similarly, as regards the support for the farmers, ours was a unique position. While most rich countries give hefty positive subsidies to their farmers, according to the calculations done by the Government of India itself, Indian farmers have had a negative subsidy for as long as we know. So we are switching over from a diametrically opposite position in India, from a position of a straight-jacketed, almost statized agriculture into a system where the intervention of the state is supposed to be minimized. So we are not starting on a blank slate, we are starting with a certain background.
Now you mentioned negative subsidy. As you know, much of that is because we were really providing very high protection to our industry. And so when you do the aggregate measure of support, you find negative subsidy. But supposing we leave that behind and we now go to the last 5-6 years when we have actually seen the reforms moving after the WTO agreement, would you say that we have really bridged this gap a little bit? Is agriculture more on a level playing field today than it was before the WTO agreement?
The idea that negative subsidies or sort of bias against agriculture necessarily came from bias in favor of industry is only partly correct. there were direct trade measures taken by governments, successive governments, and consistently taken, that had the effect of depressing agricultural prices in India.
You mean export controls?
Export controls, dumping by the government itself against its own farmers in its own commodity markets, restrictions on movements, restrictions on processing, restrictions on even movement from one state to another.
Are you referring to the public distribution system as dumping? Or what do you mean by dumping?
For example, 3 years back, when in India the domestic price, I don't remember the figures correctly, but I think it was something like 580 rupees per quintal. We imported wheat from Argentina and Mexico and Australia, where the landed cost was very much higher than the domestic price going. Now this is the kind of thing, if done by any private party, suppose it's called dumping. That is, you are actually trying to sell at a price which is less than what it would be in their own domestic markets. So we were in a situation where the government was obstructing exports and the government was itself carrying out imports which were not commercial. Now we are switching over from that kind of a position to a WTO kind of position where all government interventions are supposed to be distortive and therefore to be scaled down according to a program that has been worked out by the WTO.
Would that be in the interest of India in the long run?
Interest of India is difficult to say, but I can say one thing, that the farmers' movement that I represent has been advocating that kind of an agenda for the last 20 years. In fact, when I read the first Dunkel draft, what I said is that this is our agenda which is being put forward now by the WTO. And I said even at that time that this badge that I'm wearing, if I see Mr. Dunkel, I'll put it on his lapel. So it's not something that is that has been coming from outside. Might be there was some influence from the World Bank, from the IMF, or possibly some of the developed countries. But this has been our agenda as well, because Indian farmers, straitjacketed as they were by all kinds of restrictions within the country and outside the country, wanted that they should get at least what they would have got in a normal free market.
And yet you want higher and higher procurement price.
See, we asked for prices that would cover the cost of production because the prices were depressed by specific government measures. For example, the first agitation we started was on onions, or the second agitation was on sugarcane prices. In those cases, the government had imposed bans on export of onion, with the result that the prices went down. And our argument was that if for any political reason, or for the reason that you want to satisfy the consumers, you are taking certain measures of not allowing the export, then it becomes your responsibility to see that the farmers get the price that they would have got in a free market. And one of the definitions of free market prices, of course, is equal to the cost. So that the best estimate you can get of what would have been the price had the government not intervened. That is where we ask for specific prices. But unlike the labor movement, our stand never was that we should get more and more. In fact, I remember in 1982, we specifically turned down a proposal which wanted that the agricultural prices should be index-based, like the wages of the government servant. We turned it down and said, it's not possible.
But you know, if you are for free trade in agricultural commodities, one of the things that people are worried about is that if you have exports and imports freed in agriculture, then, you know, you will be vulnerable to the shocks in world agricultural supplies. What is your reaction to that? Or do you think that the change in prices would actually be less if you were to engage in trade?
I would compare it with the position of a closed economy and a restricted economy. And I think between the two bad situations, I would certainly prefer a situation where we have options, where I am able to choose. In the previous situation, it's the government which decided. So I didn't even know what the rules of the game were. I could decide, for example, to keep back my crop of paddy, and then suddenly find that the government had decided to import paddy for rice from Burma, and the prices would go down. Open market would give at least long-term secular kind of rules of the game, where it would be easier for the farmers to make decisions both about the crop pattern and about marketing.
Would you say that we in India have put too much emphasis on food grains and not enough on other crops? Why should we have to produce all the demand that we have for food grains? We can always import if we have better comparative advantage in producing other crops, for example. Many people believe that Punjab straying into rice paddy cropping is really the result of assured marketing at predetermined prices. So the farmer, plays it safe and goes in for cropping something in which Punjab is really not best suited. What would be your reaction to that?
I don't think it was entirely a decision on the part of the farmers. The system was so developed that Punjabi farmer had to accept the wheat paddy trap. For example, if I apply for a sugar mill in Maharashtra, I am more likely to get the license than if I were in Punjab. While Punjab can produce a number of things with advantage, a whole complex of policies have favored Punjabi farmer remaining or giving at least a high priority to the food grains. Another problem that recently cropped up is we have a serious shortage of edible oils and oil seeds. And what needs to be done is shifting at least some part of the irrigated land from food grains to oil seeds. This could most conveniently happen in Punjab. And if we, without going into the question of justification for the minimum support price of wheat, if we had given some increase to the oil seeds, then we would have possibly helped solve that problem. But the government would prefer that the edible oil development and the oil seed development takes place somewhere else rather than in Punjab. So it's not entirely the decision of the farmers. It's unbelievable, but there is hardly anything that is private about Indian agriculture. It's actually a departmentalized agriculture where all significant decisions, starting from the land to the use of inputs to the disposal of outputs, is finally made by the government.
Now, as we look at the reforms in the Indian industrial sector over the past 10 years, we find that there is not that much happening in traditional industries. Industries like sugar, cotton textiles, which have backward linkages to agriculture. But how much have we reformed there, and how much has Indian agriculture benefited with those reforms?
Well, till at least 5 years back, I said that the reforms have not touched agriculture at all, and Dr. Manmohan Singh also agreed with me at that time. We have all the restrictions on movement and storage practically continuing as they were with minor changes. The systems of levy and procurement have only been slightly modified. The forward and backward linkage industries continue to be under licenses all over. Sugar has not been delicensed, fertilizers have not been delicensed. In Maharashtra, you can't start even a cotton gin factory. You can't take cotton to Madhya Pradesh or nearby Andhra Pradesh. So that kind of a sort of truncated system does exist in India. And as you started with WTO, I would take advantage of this point to say that even before we globalize, our Indian agriculture needs to Indianize. We need to have a single Indian economic market before we can effectively take part in the world market. Because we are not properly resolved, and that was the point you were making, we are not properly resolved the question of comparative advantages within the domestic economy. And if you are not resolved that, then any arrangement which emphasizes comparative advantage at the global level is not going to work.
Now, on April 1, 2001, quantitative restrictions on imports of agricultural items would go. Now, of course, the finance minister has raised duties on some of these items, but there is this fear and apprehension that you are going to open the floodgate of imports, even though at some tariff rates, some duties, what that is going to do to Indian farmer. I think dairy industry is particularly worried about the impact of...
Dairy is worried, poultry is worried. In case of edible oils, they are in a bad position. But I think they are taking a more open look at it, that if a consumer is likely to get a product of a better quality at a cheaper price, then a domestic producer is justified in coming in the way only for a limited period of time. He can't go on hiding behind the protectionist wall, keeping his inefficiencies like the manufacturers of Ambassador and Fiat cars. They will have to say that we need 5 years, because everybody accepts that Indian agriculture received a stepmotherly treatment and would possibly need some time to adjust. But given that, I don't think the experience of last year, when 715 commodities were quantitative restrictions were abolished, last year's experience up to now doesn't show anything like floodgates opening up. But I'm not saying that that may not happen. I think we should proceed with the expectation that that might happen. And we have some kind of safeguards, not only in the form of tariff walls, but we can take specific measures against surges. We can take specific measures in case where national security is involved or where some religious sentiments are involved. There are a whole battery which still remains, but we should use it very warily so that nobody gets an impression that India is trying to run away from the commitments in WTO. The basic problem in case of the quantitative restrictions is as follows. Under the socialist regime, practically imports of all things were banned. That didn't mean that imports didn't come in. They came in only through those lucky few who had contacts in the corridors and who managed to get license and permit. So the quantitative restrictions were implemented more through breaches rather than through implementation. And it is these breaches which became an important and major instrument of economic policy. Now what's going to happen is governments are going to be required to put a tariff wall instead of an absolute restriction.
And that too within committed rates. Now are you
committed where the commitment is by the government itself. It's
correct.
Not imposed
no,
by...
I agree. But are you reasonably satisfied with the bindings that we have for agricultural items on tariff rates?
I think in most cases they are excessively liberal.
So we have enough room.
We have enough room in most cases. But then that's like trying to work out the average depth of a river. There can be some problems in places. But I think the more important thing is to understand that protection can be only time bound. And if you get 4 or 5 years, you will have to develop some program where there is some promise of Indian producers becoming competitive. And they cannot, I think that there will have to be some kind of adjustment in crop patterns which may look agonizing at some point but may prove out to be good in the long run.
Does the Indian farmer understand this?
The farmers I know appear to understand it. At least the movement that I am connected with appear to have. But then there are others who appear to have some serious difficulties. But that's understandable. And the Chinese girls, when their legs were no more bound by the communist government, they were complaining against their legs being unbounded. But that kind of a reaction is to be expected. Similarly, somebody who is addicted to drug would always complain about being forcibly taken away from the addiction.
But you mentioned several times that we need time before our agriculture becomes competitive. Is the government of India doing enough, or the state governments doing enough on irrigation front, on availability of power at affordable prices, on water conservation, all these fronts, so that investment in rural infrastructure is increasing and that enables our agriculture to become more competitive?
Well, if the government had really to do that kind of infrastructure building and technology providing, it would be a very difficult job. In fact, since independence, most governments have believed that their job is to provide infrastructure and technology, and the farmers will produce the best they can. And the price and the incentives are not a relevant factor as far as the farmers are concerned. That was the basic philosophy. I think all that we expect the government to do is to keep its hands off.
But in the 80s and to some extent even in the 1990s, what we have seen in Indian agriculture is that subsidies have been increasing, but public investment in agriculture has been going down. So does that worry you?
Subsidy, I am totally for abolition of all governmental subsidies because they are bad per se. They are stifling. And I don't think there is anything like a subsidy to Indian farmers. Neither in about electricity and fertilizers, I can demonstrate it on paper that what really benefits non-farming communities is passed off as a subsidy to farmers. They are really not the beneficiaries at all. So rather than do that kind of a thing, I have even said that the zero tariff electric supply can do damage to the farmers. So what we need or ask for is not really subsidies. We would like, for example, total destatization of Indian agriculture. We would also like to have all restrictions removed from within the domestic market so that we have one Indian economic unity. We would like the government to provide some infrastructure, for example, preparing an information network where farmers can get information on commodity prices in various important markets in the world, or get reliable information on weather or extension advice would be very good, and the government could play an important role. The government could also play an important role by promoting the development of a marketing system alternative to the system of agricultural produce marketing committees. These are the committees which did good work for some time. Now they have got highly politicized. They hardly provide any basic marketing facilities. Generally, they don't provide even for testing and grading, proper storage or processing. And in India, we have a system where farmers go to APMCs and non-farmers go to their own parallel marketing system. The world over, supermarkets is the combining point for the consumers, and all the producers ultimately merged into that network, with the result that the length of the chain of intermediaries practically doesn't exist there.
Do you think the private trade can actually play an important role in wholesale distribution of agricultural commodities in India? Right now, there's sort of a virtual monopoly by the government.
It's a monopoly. It's a state system. They could, and I think the government could be the beneficiary. For example, if instead of the Food Corporation of India doing the kind of hackneyed procurement that they do, without providing anything like the post-harvest infrastructure, that is the reason why we have this excessive stock of food grains. If we had private sector coming in, which could offer the farmers an advance, let's say, of 70% of the market price on anything that is put in the warehouse, or if the warehouse receipts could be made a negotiable instrument, I think the entire framework of the Food Corporation of India, etc., could be scrapped overnight. But I think there is a fairly strong lobby behind the public distribution system and Food Corporation of India. Nobody is going to, they will make all kinds of humanist arguments, leftist arguments, but nobody will take that a whole branch of government of India should be thus scrapped.
How important an obstacle do you think is the Essential Commodities Act in all this?
It's one of the most important single obstruction. And if we remove that, we will have opened the way for liberalization of the domestic market.
But how exactly does it come in the way?
Anytime the government, for true or untrue reasons, thinks that there is a problem about public distribution, it can intervene and issue orders that can block the transport of commodities from one district to another, one state to another. Some of my friends and even me, we have got arrested and sentenced to 28 days of jail simply because we tried to carry 20 kilos of wheat from Punjab to Haryana. Under the Essential Commodities Act, some of my friends were arrested because they could not deliver the minimum quantum of jawar that was fixed by the government, because that year the crop was bad. And the government expected that they should purchase the necessary quantity from the market at a higher price and give it in levy to the government. That is the kind of system which, in the hands of the bureaucrats, Essential Commodities Act can mean. It's a pretty bad thing. So one of these largest single obstacles would be essential commodities. And I don't know why finance minister after finance minister announces in the budget speech that this will be done, but in fact nothing happens.
Has this been announced before?
5 times, at least 5 times. And I think I have counted only from Manmohan.
5 times since 1991.
Practically every speech, every economic survey mentions the importance of removing the or attenuating the Essential Commodities Act, number one, and number two, the importance of land legislation that would permit at least operative consolidation of land. These are things which are oft repeated but never implemented.
And as a result, we don't really have a unified market within the country. You can't move.
We don't have a unified market because of the Essential Commodities Act primarily. Secondly, the land has got so fragmented, and that's another very serious problem coming to WTO. It would be very difficult to compete with in the world market given the present size of holdings. I don't want to get into the whole controversy about who should own land, whether it should go to the tiller or the poor or landless level, etc. But it should be possible even for the poor to pool together their land so that the operations take place on a scale which is competitive.
Thank you very much, Mr. Joshi. So much, I think this has been really very enlightening. What I gather from you is that WTO forces us to make certain commitments which we make voluntarily as a government.
Which we have been wanting as farmers.
Yeah, well, yes. But certainly we need to do much more with our own policies if we want to give a better life to our farmers.
Right. I think if there are a few minutes, I would say that WTO is at the most 5 years old. And the poverty and the misery of the farmers is certainly much longer than that. So the problems couldn't be all related to WTO.
And we have to work on it ourselves. With thank you very much. We will be back same time, same day next week. Until then, goodbye.